I'm Liz Farmer. I am a fiscal policy writer, and today we're welcoming two governors with us, Governor Kolongoski of Oregon and Governor Douglas of Vermont, and they both served between 2003 and 2011, so right in the meat of the last recession and prior to it. And so this panel is going to be a bit of a history lesson. I think Mark Zandi kind of teed this off depressingly wonderfully, if we can say that as a phrase. You know, I've heard him speak a few times, and I'm not sure I've ever heard him be so negative. So that's certainly something to take into consideration. Like I said, this is going to be a bit of a history lesson, so I sort of want to set the stage a bit for what was going on in the years and months leading up to and when the financial downturn started. And so, just as a reminder, the Great Recession, it started at the end of 2007, and it was the largest collapse in state revenues on record. By 2010, states were looking at a loss of $191 billion in total in revenue that they had lost from the start of the downturn. And of course, when there are times of economic downturns, there's more pressure on social safety net services and things that cost states more money. And so you have that sort of inverse effect of more budget pressure at a time when the dollars are disappearing. And so I'd like to set the stage a little bit individually for these two states. For Vermont, heading into 2009, before the federal stimulus dollars began kicking in, the state was looking at an $82 million deficit heading into 2009. And if you think that's bad, the analysts were projecting a $253 million deficit for 2010. Things got so bad that the University of Vermont, in the course of cutting millions of dollars from its budget, scrapped the varsity baseball and softball teams. And that sort of thing was very common during the Great Recession. I mean, major athletics teams just getting erased from the books. And I think Vermont's trough was in 2009, the state revenue trough, and revenues were down 8% from their pre-recession peak. And then we have Oregon, which was even worse.
Of course.
Because it's a competition. And its trough, revenues fell 15% from their pre-recession peak at the lowest point during the recession for Oregon. And heading into 2009, it was looking at $1 billion deficit to tackle. And at that point, Governor Kolongoski had ordered agencies to cut 5% of whatever was left of the remaining 6 to 7 months of the fiscal year. And again, across the board budgets, another very common move by lawmakers and governors during the recession. And so it had $1 billion deficit to tackle, but then the out years, the following 2 years, revenue forecasters were predicting that the state was going to be looking at a $762 million hole. So overwhelming numbers, and I wanted to kind of start off by asking you all, every state is different. Different things drive different budgets. And so I wanted to start off by asking what the economic drivers were for your individual states' budgets and how those started showing up as red flags, perhaps, when you first started getting an inkling that things were going to start going south. And we'll start left to right.
Go ahead. Which is left?
Sorry, my left.
Oh. Well, thank you, Liz, for setting the stage. The reason, first of all, that the budget shortfall was projected to triple between 2009 and 10 in Vermont, I believe, was that the legislature overrode my budget veto and spent more than they should have. But seriously, that exacerbated the challenge that we were already confronting. We have a well-diversified economy, manufacturing, higher education, agriculture, healthcare, and of course tourism, so that it wasn't over-reliant on a single sector. I remember chatting at the time with Ted and some of our colleagues and expressing a relative pleasure that I wasn't the governor of, say, Michigan, that's overwhelmingly dominated by a particular industry, because we have some diversification. We acted quickly in Vermont. Beginning in January of 2009, I took a 5% pay cut and invited all of the folks in my administration to do the same. That allowed us to go to the bargaining table with the state employees union and extract a 3% cut from them, which had never happened in our state's history and hasn't happened since. We downsized our workforce by 7.8%, mostly through attrition, but not entirely. We had layoffs, which were unpleasant, but the reality that we were confronting at the time. We took advantage of the extra food stamp opportunities to which Mark referred earlier. We faced the challenge, as you well know, of a time of revenue contraction exactly when the burden of public service demand is greater. So it's a real collision of fiscal pressures that made it particularly challenging for all of us at the time. But there was an analysis done by one of the major media outlets after the recession, and they rated Vermont as the fourth least economically stressed state coming out of the recession. And so I felt really good about how people in the public and private sectors came together. I went to a church and stacked firewood for families who needed it. We made state forest land available to lower and moderate income people to get the firewood they need. We're cold in Vermont in the winter, as you know, and so I think the combination of our responses ultimately served us well. But it was a challenging time, and one that we'll certainly remember, but hope not to experience again.
Wonderful. And Governor Kolongoski.
Well, Oregon has a economic structure that makes it very, very difficult for us to handle recessions. And just to give you a broad profile, Oregon is the 10th largest state in land area. Until 1980, it was a natural resource-based economy of timber, agriculture, fishing. There was even gold mining. We did not have much technology. Technology in Oregon prior to 80 was Tektronix. It was an oscilloscope building company. They had a couple spinoffs. Intel did not come to Oregon, which now is our largest employer, until 1978, and they have built out, and they have a bigger and bigger footprint in Oregon. But the important thing to understand, it's a manufacturing technology base that they have for us. The other weakness for us is that we're an income tax state. We do not have a general sales tax. I think we're only one or two states in the country that do not have a sales tax or a three-pronged taxation system. I shouldn't say that because our neighbors just to the north of us, who we are always looking at, Washington is just the opposite. They're a sales tax state. They have no income tax. So when a recession comes to us, what happens is we have a quarterly forecast, and it's based upon income tax filings. And we were picking up very quickly in 2007 that people were not filing. Businesses were holding back, not filing on their quarterlies. Employees that were going to file, they were filing their their advance payments. They weren't filing. So we had a fairly good idea that something was up. And the other thing I have to tell you is that in the federal-state relationship, Oregon is one of those 5 states out west that have had this ongoing relationship with the federal government since our inception. And as an example, the federal government owns 52% of Oregon, and we're heavily reliant upon their footprint here in Oregon. And it isn't just the timber. It's the Bonneville Power Administrations, the Corps of Engineers. There are a large number of natural resource agencies in Oregon because of the ocean, fish, birds, everything else. So what happened is that in a snapshot of Oregon is that in this heyday in the 70s and 80s, we were cutting about 8 to 9 billion board feet of timber off of the both federal and state lands, with the federal government being the dominant piece on the federal forest lands. After the environmental legislation of around endangered species, water quality, everything else, the federal government today has probably less than 1 billion board feet off of the timberlands. The reason why this is so important to us is that there's another federal program that off of the federal forest lands that were run by agriculture, we got 25% of the receipts from the sale of the timber off those lands, and there were 24 of the 36 counties in Oregon that were heavily reliant upon that money. And the other big agency is the Bureau of Land Management, and there we have this unique, which takes a longer time to explain, called O&C lands, over Oregon and California railroad lands, of a fraud that they gave the railroads to build a railroad. It was a land scam. The government took the land back. We get 75% of the cut off of those lands for these counties where those trees are located. The dilemma for us is, with less than 1 million board feet of federal timber cut, these counties who have for years relied upon that payment from the federal government are in deep financial straits today, still. There are 12 counties that are so heavily reliant upon it that it was a cultural problem for us because they had gotten so used. I mean, the government gave us over $500 million. And they were using that money to actually fund their county governments. And now you go and tell them to raise their property taxes, and everybody in the county says, well, we've never paid property tax at that rate, and they won't. And so this was putting pressure on the state because of the decline in the federal receipts off the forest land, and because of the nature of our tax system, and because of our economic mix, which is manufacturing predominantly. And we have a budgeting process where what we do is to start off with the governor looks at the last biennium's budget, adds a number of inflation factors, which we call the continuing service level budget, and that means just that this is how much money you need to fund what you had the last time, and we were $2.6 billion down. And Oregon, as an example, I think the national unemployment rate was about 9.5. I heard the economists say it was around 10, but in Oregon it was 12.5. And it was very, very difficult for us. And so we knew coming in, because I was getting the quarterly financial reports, that we were in trouble. We made the budget cut at the end, as Liz said, at the end of the budgetary process. And so 5% of what they had at that time was probably more like 20% and of what they had to cut. And how we handled this is actually probably the thing that I thought was we did best of all. The Senate President and I had known each other for years, and I used to go have breakfast with him every Saturday morning. And the sole purpose of our meeting was to keep the legislature from coming into session. Because what we both concluded, and this is true, what we both concluded, if they came in, this was going to be a food fight. Because everybody has an interest group, and our objective was to keep them out, and I would handle it through a statutory process called an allotment process, which designates where the budget cuts would come from, and we were able to do that. And so there was some ardor about this that helped us a great deal, and I've always thought that if the Senate President hadn't stepped up and said, and they couldn't come in without his approval, because you need both the House and the Senate to agree, and he just said he wouldn't do it. And it took a lot of flack because the legislators wanted to be part of the cuts, and we both agreed that it wasn't good for them to do that. So that's how we went through this time period.
Yeah, and Governor, thank you. And you started this talking about what you do in terms of I mean, cutting. Cutting is kind of the first knee-jerk response, right? And maybe dipping into your reserves. Governor Douglas, I want to hear a little bit more about your interaction with the legislature and that historic veto.
Well, we did not dip into our reserves, of which I'm very proud. Our budget stabilization reserves were intact throughout this process, as were our AAA bond ratings. So I think we handled it well from that standpoint. But in 2009, as you suggested, Liz, the legislature overrode my budget veto. I think most commentators would suggest that I was right after the fact, but it exacerbated the challenge in the years going forward, including those after I left office, because Ted and I both left in January of 2011. So I think it could have been handled a little better. But cutting is not easy. We have a process in Vermont where a joint fiscal committee comprised of 5 members of each chamber is empowered to approve budget changes when the legislature is not in session up to a certain level, and so we utilized that process. We reduced our headcount of state employees, as I mentioned. I remember talking with my budget team, going over potential cuts, and I had a major initiative in terms of dental health for kids. My wife was a dental assistant for 39 years. And they said, well, we got to trim back on this. And I said, oh, that's my initiative. And they said, well, yeah, but everything's got to be on the table. And so we cut back on that as well. Probably the most controversial cut was closing some of our highway, well, either rest area or welcome center, we like to call it. And I got an awful lot of pushback on that. But I said, well, if it's going to be keeping the rest area open or essential human services for the people of the state, I think I know where the priority is. And I remember saying to people, as the years go by, those rest areas are more important. I get that, but I think that's something that's going to have to yield. So we went through that process of making choices. That's what government is all about. I quoted President Kennedy, who once said, "To govern is to choose." And I explained to the legislature that that was our responsibility, and we had to work together to make some choices, and overall, we did.
So during this time, I mean, leading into 2009, pretty much, you know, in 08, there was talk of a federal stimulus and how the federal government can play a role. And so I'm curious between, you know, in 08 and leading up to 09, when they figured something out, how were states involved, and what were those discussions like, Governor Douglas?
Well, it started early on, and Ted, I don't know if you were there, right after the 08 election, the president-elect invited governors to come to talk about everything, or anything, but particularly the financial crisis that we were facing. On about a week and a half's notice, 50 governors showed up in Philadelphia. I don't mean one from every state. There were some governors-elect, there were some territorial governors, but we had the whole gang there pretty well with the president-elect and vice president-elect to talk about this. And then in December, I was vice chairman of NGA at the time. I appeared with a couple of colleagues before the House Appropriations Committee. So they began to work on this before the new administration came in. And I kind of could get a sense of what was coming by the give and take with the members of the House, because every subcommittee chairman was determined to get something within his or her jurisdiction into the package. And so I realized early on that this was going to be more constrained than governors would prefer. And I realized that there's a school of thought that the earlier package that Ann mentioned an hour or so ago in 03 had too much discretion. Some called it governor's slush funds, although they never told me that I had one. But I think it was an overreaction because I take education, for example, which is the second biggest piece of the package. Well, in Vermont, we're facing a demographic crisis. The number of kids in our public schools has declined by 1% per year for each of the last 20, and it's going to continue for 20 more. We don't need more teachers. We don't need as many as we have. We need fewer schools, and they're going through a consolidation and closure process now. So my point is, rather than bolster teacher salaries, wouldn't it have been nice to be able to use that money for transition funds to achieve some school consolidation and blunt the impact in some of our communities? So I think there really should have been more flexibility for states, because one size doesn't fit all.
Mm-hmm. And Kolongoski, what do you think about that? How were states involved, and was the flexibility, could have been better or worse?
Well, as I said, I think Oregon's had a long-standing history in relationships with the federal government. So this is, it's a love-hate relationship. I mean, it's just two partners, and we agree sometimes, and sometimes we don't agree. And I think I had the record for suing the federal government when I was governor over a variety of environmental issues. Let me, I was just remembering something that Jim just said, is that I remember that right after I got elected, we came back to D.C. I think there were 12 governors that were new at that time, and there was a governor's school. And I remember somebody saying to us, he says, you guys are really lucky. And I'm saying to myself, because we're in this coming out of this recession of the dot-com, and they said, look, every governor in an 8-year period will have a recession. And you guys are very lucky because you've got yours coming in. This is a free ride after you get through this one. And foolishly, I believed that. And I kept sitting, I said, God, and if you look at it, in about 05, 06, we were on the ascendancy, and I'm thinking, boy, they were right about this. And then, you know, what happened. But, you know, in looking at how you handle these things like this, and I remember one particular debate I was having with the head of my Human Services Department. It's the Social Safety Net Agency. And it was corrections. And I had, and it was just me and these two. And Dr. Goldberg never talked about money when he talked to you. He was the head of the Human Services, the Department of Human Services. He always talked about people. You know, he said, this is what's going to happen if you cut that budget here. And he would give me this picture of these children and all of this, and it always gave me tears in my eyes as he would talk to me. And Max Williams, who's now, by the way, the executive director of the largest foundation in Oregon, the Oregon Community Foundation, and Max looked at me, and he ran the corrections department at that time. And he said, Governor, you and I both know this is why you hate lawyers, and you pick them to run agencies. He said, you know, if government can only do one thing, just one, a state government, we don't coin money, we don't have to have a huge military. The one thing you have to do is to ensure that the citizens are safe in their homes and on the streets of their community. And that's why you have to prioritize what I'm asking you to do. And those are the debates you have with people about what you're going to do. And they're both right. And I had served on the Supreme Court, so I kind of leaned toward Max's argument, but I wasn't about to go out and tell the public I cut the human service budget to keep more people in jail. I didn't think that was a good thing to do, and it wasn't the right thing to do. So Dr. Goldberg won. And, but it is the difficult, because when I say we cut the budgets 5%, they're not equal. Mm-hmm. They have different impacts. And a lot of them are just administrative process, like Jim said, the number of people. We did the same thing through attrition. We didn't hire people. We had a reserve fund of about $800 million before the federal government stepped in. I also had the experience of the 01-03 stimulus that came in. And Liz had asked us before we got here, do you guys remember it? And I vaguely remembered it because it came in two pieces. The one piece was direct, and it was more on the social side. It was a tax cut. It was the Bush tax cuts. And the other side was this, I can't remember it. Was it 10 or $20 billion? But we got about 200 million. And for the death of me, I cannot remember what we did with that 200 million. And the reason was it was unrestricted. The government didn't put any restrictions on it. And I think I know what I did with it. I think I dumped it into the school fund, is what I did. And subsidized at that time as it was coming out of the 01-03 recession. And I put it in there. But it was an interesting distinction because I love getting unrestricted funds. He put more hooks on the one in 08 and required us to report and to do a number of things. And I actually called our old budget guy before I came here, and I asked him, do you know what we did with that? He couldn't remember. And that's why you probably should have some transparency and accountability when you give us the money.
That's an excellent point. And I'm curious, now that you're both not in office anymore, just this idea of accountability and, you know, with the federal stimulus, I mean, yes, it's a real pain to be diligent and be constrained with how you can spend the money and have to report it. But from an accountability perspective, is that the better way to do it, or is there some sort of happy balance between, free money and what was what came in '09.
I think I lean toward the free money side of the equation, but, and with all due respect to our federal partners, states have to balance budgets every year. They have to live within their means.
Yeah.
Who are these folks who can rack up $1 trillion deficit and spend money on bridges to nowhere telling us how to manage our money? I mean, come on. So I really trust states to get the job done, to make responsible decisions about spending priorities, and there certainly has to be accountability, and the ARA really relied on state auditing functions to a major degree, and then it was kind of reviewed at the federal level. So I think that's a process that works. And I come back to what I said earlier, one size doesn't fit all. States are in different places. Ted mentioned that Oregon had an unemployment rate that was well above the national average. Ours has been consistently below. It's 2.1% today. We just can't find anybody to work in Vermont, so if you have friends who want to come. So I just think states are different enough that this kind of federal proscription really is not the way to go.
A story. I remember now, as we were talking here, there was one issue that came in the ARA stimulus that I actually had a great pause. And for me to not want money as a Democrat, you got to understand, I actually was thinking, why do I want to do this? And I'll tell you what it was, is the ARA, we probably got $1 billion in that for education, for schools. And what happened was that the largest chunk of it, 600 and some million, as I recall, went to special education. But it went directly to the school districts. It did not come to the state. It was sent to them. And I remember the budget people, we were sitting around talking, and at first there was this, hey, this is cool. Look at how much money we're getting. And then we started into, well, you know what they're doing? Because most of the money that we got that were for social services, whether it was TANF or SNAP or housing or whatever, there is a benchmark out there because this is case-driven. There are people, and we know what we're spending the money on, and we can actually evaluate it. When that money for special education went, it was not about caseload. It was just a single grant. Well, what you did is in the school districts, you increased those budgets for us, and this was a one-time payment.
Right.
And as soon as I got done, I now had the problem, because the state supplies 70% of the K through 12 school funding, I had to come up with, well, how do I fill that hole? And there was actually a debate about, well, do you want to take it? And I think, in a common, after the Affordable Care Act, I remember that there were a number of southern states that didn't want to increase the Medicaid match. And this is our relationship with the federal government. My biggest concern is federal government makes promises. And under the Affordable Care Act, it was 100% to 2019. Then after 2019, it was 90%. And then after 19 something else, it was 80%. And every governor knows from experience with the federal government, what the government giveth, they can take away. And a lot of people say, why would I want to do this? Because we're going to blow our budgets up, and we're going to end up holding the bag. And we're the ones that are going to have to fund this a long time, no matter what the government said. And I think that was now, Oregon wasn't one of the states, because we have utilized the Medicaid program to fund our Oregon Health Plan. But just look at it from our position. It is good today. There's a consequence for your goodness. And we're going to end up having to pay for it. And we do many, many times.
Ted makes a great point. Of course, the ARA funding was spread over several years, so we were able to wean ourselves off it over the course of 2 or 3 years. But you're right. Eventually, the state has to pick up the slack. But I guess I thought it worked well in that there was such a sudden, unexpected collapse of our revenue structure that infusion was necessary and welcome at that particular time. And of course, there were two types of our funding, the support principally in Medicaid and education that you've discussed, and then the grants that were competitive and handed out by various federal agencies, and those were less concerning in terms of ongoing budget requirements. So I guess it was okay overall. I still think there could have been more discretion for states, but it was the right remedy at the right time.
Let's talk a little bit more about where the money went. And I mean, were there some categories that were easier to get money to than others? Were there political pressures one way or the other? Governor Douglas, you want to?
Well, we had an unusual alliance for a smart grid grant that we requested of the federal government. Every electric utility in Vermont, there were only 20, got together and filed a common application. And what I heard at the time was in some states they were competing with each other. But in Vermont, we had only one unified application, and it was successful. And I think that was very helpful in accelerating moving the state toward a smart grid, and we got there faster than we would have otherwise. There was some sluggishness on the part of some federal agencies, frankly. I know some of the rural broadband grants from NTIA and RUS were a little slow in coming, and we got into the first couple of months of 2010, which was a year after the act passed, and they'd only distributed like 15% of the broadband grants, and they were starting a second round, and some places were wondering whether they should apply for the second round when they hadn't heard yet whether their applications for the first round had been approved. So there were some administrative issues at some points at the federal level, but these competitive grants for Vermont at least went largely for our broadband build out and for the smart grid, and that was very helpful. And of course, transportation, we haven't talked about that, but it did accelerate paving projects. I'm not sure that it prompted new shovel-ready projects, but it accelerated ones that we already had in the pipeline, and that was welcome. The accountability piece, Liz, was kind of interesting. I'm interested in Ted's thoughts too, but we had to quantify the number of jobs created or retained in the. You mentioned the reporting requirement, and it's a little squirrelish to come up with those numbers. I remember talking with my czar. Kind of funny. You think of czar as absolute power, but he reported to the governor. So. But we were hypothesizing if we have a bridge project and we had a truss built on site, we could identify the number of jobs created. But what if we bought a pre-constructed truss to bring to the site? How do we calculate the number of jobs that went into that? So I would frankly take the number of jobs created with somewhat of a grain of salt, but it certainly was helpful. We didn't reach the target that the administration and Congress set of a 8% unemployment rate, but it helped move us in the right direction.
How about you, Governor Kolongoski?
Because of the high unemployment rate, I actually prioritized the social safety net in Oregon. I was after this, and I think we probably on a per capita basis had one of the largest utilizations of the SNAP program of any state in the country, and I think we may still do because of that. And TANF was another one that we were trying to get money to and expand the caseloads. I remember, and it was one of the anomalies about the recession, I passed probably the largest, the legislature passed and I signed it, but I created the program. It was my idea. But I decided that one of the things I wanted to do was to have every child in Oregon under 18 have access to health care. And I wanted to expand our Oregon Health Plan, which is this relationship with the federal government and Medicaid and our contribution to it. And it's a very unique program because, to be very truthful with you, it's a it's rationing health care from a list. It's the unique system that Oregon has. So what I did And because I was always observing, even in prior administrations when I was in other positions, every time there was a recession, low-income programs get cut. That's just, it's the soft underbelly of politics in every state, is that it's who advocates for these people. And so I decided that what we would do is develop a children's program that would be driven into the middle class. And so I actually had as a target 185% of the poverty level, which meant there were people in Oregon, here's the recession, and I've got a program, and I'm actually going to have people who are making $60,000 to $75,000 have access to health care for their children. And the reason, and the legislature bought it, and the reason is I said, you know, if we drive it into the middle class, this will not be the first thing cut, because it just didn't make any political sense for these people when you've got their neighbors where they live on this plan. And we did this in the recession, so I utilized every dollar I could, and we used a hospital provider tax is the funding mechanism of it. And I think we probably have one of the highest percentage of children covered of any state in the country for health care, and it was the right decision. But it was because I just decided that the social safety net was what we had to maintain during this period of time. We did the same thing Jim said. I think we must have got $300, $400, $500 million on transportation. That was very, very beneficial to us at a time. It wasn't just the projects, it kept people employed. There were people that had to be, are kept employed by the state to be able to do the projects. We had a number of energy grants because we were pushing very hard to try to move. Oregon was one of the first states after California, I think, to develop a renewable portfolio standard. And we were actually investing a lot of state money as partners with wind generation, with solar. I know we got a number of grants from the Department of Energy for new companies on technology, on battery development, things of that nature. So we as tough as this was, actually we got through it as best I think that we could have by investing in the social safety net, looking to the future about renewable energy, and going that route. And there were cuts, there's no doubt about it, but it's very tough to cut education. And so it always has a priority, especially in a recession. These kids still show up for school. Kids still need hot lunches, and we have to do those things. So it's a balance that I think you have to do, but all things aren't equal when you're in this business, and you have to make choices. And Jim and I probably think we made the right choices, but other people may think differently.
So it sounds like you know, for all of the strings attached and the hoops to jump through with this money, both of you were able to seize on a need and a policy priority with Vermont broadband, with healthcare in Oregon, and able to kind of turn the stimulus into something, you know, to move something forward that may not have happened otherwise. And I'm curious, before we kind of get into the wrapping things up portion of this, was some of the federal stimulus money, I mean, grants versus just straight up funding, did some of it come with less strings attached? Was it easier to move? I mean, what were some of the, we could do kind of a compare and contrast of the mechanics of this. I mean, what was the easiest part? What was the hardest part?
I suppose the easiest part were the non-discretionary grants into Medicaid and education. You just dump it in and go for it, whereas the competitive grants required some work. But remember that not only the state could apply for grants, but individual utility companies could apply directly, municipalities could apply. So I held a couple of big meetings. We had at least one of our senators come as well with local officials and the private sector to talk about the grant process to make sure everybody was engaged in this. So I think the easy part was where we had no discretion. And just to be clear on this, I'm not sure I'd say we did things that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise, but we did them faster. I think we were on track for broadband deployment, for the smart grid development, for a lot of the transportation projects, but these accelerated those efforts, my czar estimates, by perhaps 5 years. So that's real, and as Ted said on the transportation projects, it kept people employed at a time when they needed jobs. So I think it had a very positive impact, and in that sense. You may recall that some of our colleagues on my side of the aisle said at the time, we're not going to take that federal money, it's all debt-driven, and we don't want Uncle Sam telling us what to do. In the end, of course, almost every governor took almost all the money. So I think they understood that it was beneficial.
Mm-hmm. How about in Oregon? What was the easiest and hardest, most difficult ways to spend that money?
I think Jim hit it. The direct grants to the school districts and to the Medicaid program were the best. I mean, look at my argument would be with you is that I don't think it was enough, and I'll tell you where. I think the federal stimulus should have been directed toward home ownership and trying to keep people in their homes and not lose their homes. A lot of people had their homes go into foreclosure. And to be very frank with you, I think that's some of the bitterness you're seeing played out in the body politic today is because people wondered why, if you bail out the banks and you bail out the motor companies, why couldn't you provide something to keep me in my home? I just think that it could have been broader. And I think to President Obama's position, he wanted to do that. And Congress just had a different view of it, and it couldn't happen. But I think that it was the right thing for the federal government to do at this time when all the states were in this position that we needed help. And that's what the federal government, and that's what federalism is about, is that you help us when we really need it.
Before we get to the questions, I wanted to just quickly ask you, by the time you guys were leaving office, the recession technically had ended, although state revenues certainly had not recovered. That took many more years. And although Vermont was closer to being there than Oregon was, but the stimulus money was drying out, or in some cases had completely dried out. And how was that transition? How did you prepare? Because you knew it was happening. What were some of the key things that you did to wean yourselves off?
Well, that's the budgeting challenge that Ted alluded to earlier, where everybody wants more at a time when resources are temporarily enhanced, but not over the long term. So my pitch to the legislature was we've got to recognize that this federal largesse is ending over the next couple of years. And of course, we had projections on exactly how much it was going to be. But that's when they decided to overspend and couldn't restrain themselves. And I think the state paid for that and facing consistent shortfalls during most of the time since. And it was exacerbated, because you never know what's around the corner, by a tropical storm named Irene that came to visit Vermont in the summer of 2011 after I left office. But right on the heels of the Great Recession, a natural disaster that wiped out a vast amount of infrastructure just added insult to injury. So I think we could and should have shown more budgetary restraint. I tried, but we still did okay compared to where we might have been by weaning ourselves away. I mentioned the pay cuts and the layoffs earlier. Within a couple of years after I left, all that was restored, I think unwisely, by the folks who were in charge at the time, because I remember the famous Rahm Emanuel quote about not letting a crisis go to waste. Well, I think to some degree we did. And we didn't learn from that and exercise restraint on an ongoing basis. But c'est la vie.
As Jim said, all the states are different, and some states are smarter than others. And on this one thing, Oregon isn't very smart. Through the initiative process, which the western states have, and almost where you have this direct democracy, we got past what was called a kicker, and that is the economists for the state forecast at the end of the legislative session what the revenue growth will be in the next biennium. And if it's over 2% at the end of the biennium, 2 years hence, it's like forecasting the weather on June 30th, 2000, and then predicting what the temperature is going to be on July 1, 2002. That is a tax policy for Oregon, because if it is above the 2%, all of the increase goes back to the ratepayers. It was originally a direct payment to them. It is now a tax refund. In the heart of this recession, as the governor of Oregon, I returned $1.5 billion to the taxpayers of Oregon. It is self-inflicted part of the problem that we have. And how, in the transition out of it, two things. One is that there's an individual kicker and a carpet kicker. I took the carpet kicker as the governor and the legislature, and we put it into a rainy day fund, and we had about $800 million. So it was a transition for us out of this. You know, there's no easy way that when Oregon is probably the last into a recession because of the income tax issue and our reporting, we're the last out, because the last thing employers do is hire people. So while Jim is out of the recession and they're planning going ahead, we're still probably in it, trying to figure out how we're waiting for employment to pick up. And so how the transition we do is we make a major effort to actually, on the business development side, and trying to help companies actually recover so they start hiring people, because that's our lifeblood in Oregon. It is, looking at it again, I think that when I left office because of the recession in 2010, I actually got a group together and we developed what we call the reset. And it was my effort to look at Oregon state government and move forward after I left office, that it's a blueprint of what we have to do. And it ranged all the way from the way we budget to the kicker. The hardest one for me, I'm a labor lawyer, by the way, by profession, and I represent unions. And the state does not look at total compensation for its member. Pensions and health care are given. All they bargain about is the salary. The overhead cost of our pension fund, which I imagine is in every state in this country on the public side, and the health care cost are driving the fixed cost to do business as a state higher and higher every year. And if there's a recession, what the greatest fear I have, since we have a defined benefit plan and 2/3 of the plan is funded by earnings from the $80 billion fund, I'm in trouble. The state's in trouble, because we've got to make that up, because if we lose that 2/3 contribution, it goes to 60%, I have to go back and get the local governments to pay for it.
And Governor, I want to stop you there. We could have a whole other panel on pensions,
Yes,
trust me. I am a big fan of talking about those ad nauseum, but I want to open it up to the audience to make sure
They
we
could
get
ask.
some questions answered. Or sorry, not the audience. The audience's index cards. And and this is actually a great question, because this was top of mind after Governor Douglas, you mentioned, well, both of you have talked about rainy day funds. And the question says, besides building rainy day funds, what's your advice on what state governments can be doing now to ease the stress of the next recession?
Well, I think take Mr. Zandi's counsel to heart and recognize that recessions happen. We don't know when, we don't know exactly what the depth will be, but the economy goes in cycles, and we should have what one of my predecessors referred to as full cycle budgeting, which is not to spend more when the treasury is flush and have to cut back when times get tough, but to have a sustainable spending track in good times and bad. And I'm pleased that over the 8 years of my tenure, in 7 of the 8, we increased state spending at less than the rate of inflation. Just that 1 year we didn't. So I think it's important to take a longer look and not just spend every dime that comes in, because there's something around the corner that's not going to be so pleasant.
And that's difficult, because other folks might argue that that's actually a spending cut if you're not keeping pace with inflation. But it reflects the difficult decisions that you have to make in order to keep a fiscal balance. In Oregon, how about?
The difference on the East Coast, West Coast, our population is expanding. Oregon is one of the fastest growing states in the country. So if I were to tell you, well, we can actually do what Jim said, it's not true, because I can't do that. Oregon can't do that because we have an expanding population. We have kids coming. We have a large migratory population in Oregon. And so we're actually going to end up growing the state budget. The state just passed, and there will be a $2 billion tax increase that this biennium will get $1 billion a year. And, but it is something that, in looking at our schools, our universities, we are actually going to need more money to be able to do what we want. So I think the answer for any executive today in Oregon is to read the reset report, and the second is to prioritize what you think is important, because that's what the choice is going to be at the end, because you're not going to have enough money to do everything. You've got to decide what you want to do.
Yeah, that's very true. And everyone's going to clamor for that money. I mean, stakeholders are always around. This is an interesting question that we didn't get to. How important was the role of your congressional delegation throughout the federal stimulus, pre and then during that process?
I mentioned I went to the House Appropriations Committee, and I didn't have that much interaction with our own delegation, because I think the ARA legislation was going to happen. I mean, there was a broad congressional consensus that we were going to get something. I'm sure I expressed my concern to them, as I did to the administration, about the level of flexibility that wasn't included. But they were happy, as I said, after it passed, to appear with me at events around the state to talk about grant application opportunities. But I didn't have a lot of direct interaction with them.
I was in contact with them directly, and the reason is that 2 of them, Senator Wyden, at that time, I think, was the chairman of the Revenue Committee in the Senate, and the other one was Representative Fazio, was the ranking member on the Transportation Committee in the House. So I was talking to them all the time, and they were good listeners, and they understood the problems Oregon had, and I think that they listened to us and they did everything they could for us.
All righty. So this question is about higher education, and both of you have mentioned K-12, but I don't think we've really touched on higher ed. And so this question, this audience person wants to know, we know in lean times that higher education is always one of the first areas cut in the state budget. This is because schools can just increase tuition. Maybe you can speak to that as well. It says, could you talk about this decision-making process, and do you think this will always be the case?
It's an easy hit. The questioner is correct, because there is another revenue source. And nationwide, the decline in spending on higher education was quite significant. I'm proud to report that we did not reduce spending on higher education in Vermont. We held it flat, and that was the only year it didn't increase in my 8 budgets, because we're near the bottom in terms of our per capita support for higher education. And I remember talking with the president of the University of Vermont at the time, and I asked, aren't you glad that you get so little from the state because there's nothing to cut? And he said, in a strange way I am, because I'm talking with my counterparts around the country who are getting hammered by reductions in higher ed spending, and I can say, level funding, that's the new up. So we were able to keep it level, but I'm still embarrassed at the relatively low amount of support that we offer to higher education. I wish it were more.
In Oregon, if you're ever in these positions like Jim and I were, that you make a decision and you look at that time it was the right decision, and you watch it play out, you say, God, why did I do that? I actually created a new state four-year university in Oregon, in Bend, Oregon, during my administration. And if I look at it today and I have 4 regionals that are in deep trouble, it was a wrong decision to make. And I would have actually probably put it off until a little bit later. There's a dilemma, though, that for higher education, for the questioner, I think that at some time, higher ed is going to have a meeting with itself about what the future of higher education looks like in this country. And is it bricks and mortars? Is it online? Or what it is? Because it all comes to us on bricks and mortar. And one of the biggest costs for the state of Oregon on its higher education system is deferred maintenance to keep it going. I mean, and so what, if I don't put it in deferred maintenance, because the universities, interestingly enough, will want it for administration, not deferred maintenance. They're still standing, but it's going to cost us at some time. But I think underlining this whole thing is this whole process about higher ed is, where does it go in the future? What does it look like in 20 years? And I don't know. Somebody smarter than I am is going to have to figure it out. But I can't believe, with all the technology we have, it's all bricks and mortar. Yeah. It just doesn't seem that that's the future.
I agree.
And we are kind of running out of time. And I want to save this spot for any sort of kind of parting thoughts for you all. And kick it off with myself for just, I mean, I've covered state and local governments for a while. And and we always say there's no 2 places alike. Every place is different. But just sitting here, that is very much reinforced by hearing your different experiences with your congressional delegation, with where you spent the money, with what you thought, and just it's a good reminder that every place is going to have their own unique experience with something like this. And so maybe we could finish, in a minute or less with kind of what your advice would be to governors who are going to, according to Mark Zandi, going to be facing a recession pretty soon.
Well, I think, first of all, stick together. We're going to hear from my good friend Ray on the next panel, who was the head of the Governors Association at the time. But it's important when states in various degrees are facing this tough fiscal challenge to be united, to go to Capitol Hill together. I went with a number of colleagues to talk with congressional leaders during those challenging times, and I think on a bipartisan basis, most governors will be on the same page in terms of what federal policy ought to be. Secondly, coming back to a recurring theme, I believe we ought to persuade folks in the Congress to provide flexibility for the reason you articulated, Liz. I mean, the state of Vermont is shrinking, and the state of Oregon is booming in terms of its population. We have relatively lower unemployment. We have a different economic mix. Really, states are very different in this country, and the one-size-fits-all mentality that we often see from Washington really doesn't get us all where we need to be. So I would argue in terms of maximum flexibility. Certainly couple that with transparency and accountability and oversight, that's fine. But I think we really need to let the governors and state officials make their own decisions in the interest of the people whom they represent.
Yeah. Just closing on what was just said, given money in government, in politics, and the proliferation of interest groups, and the interest groups having the institutional memory in our legislatures at the state, I think it is critically important, whether dealing with the federal government or your citizen, any governor, is the governors today have to have an idea, a plan in their mind of what they want to do. Election is more than just winning ballot at a ballot box. It's implementation of public policy. And if you haven't got a clear vision of what you want to do with the time you have, you're at the mercy of the interest groups, you're at the mercy of the federal government and everybody else. I think you have to come into it with a clear vision of what you want to do.
Well, thank you very much. Let's give them a big thank you applause.
Thank you.
And, and I'd like to remind everyone we have a 15-minute break following this panel. And so be back here for the final panel on the state and federal relationship, which should be a humdinger of a topic.